So Professor Ekstrand is an associate professor of computer science at Boise State University, where he co-directs the people and information research team. Fun fact, Boise is actually gonna host CIKM in 2 years from now. So if you want to already start planning your trip, feel free to do so. His research blends information retrieval, human-computer interaction, machine learning, and algorithmic fairness to try to make information access system good for everyone they affect. We thank Michael for being with us, even with some, unfortunate, unexpected things this week. He was supposed to come here in person, but we really, really, really appreciate the effort of still being with us online. So thank you, Michael. Floor is all yours. We are a bit late, but honestly, we don't really care. So you can take the full 40 minutes or whatever is necessary. We really look forward to your talk. Thanks again.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here, for organizing this workshop. I really like seeing this a cup like this that has the breadth and roundedness of metrics that you've put together for this. So I've entitled my talk, "Do You Want to Hunt a Kraken?" And the reason that, oh, my slides are not advancing. There they go. And where this talk or this title comes from the practice in medieval and Renaissance cartography of decorating particularly unexplored areas of the map with various sea monsters. We don't know what's there. We haven't drawn a map of it. Who knows? It might be monsters. And there are a lot of dangers in sea travel into the unknown. And so we've got these monsters filling up empty space and particularly unknown spaces of the map. And I selected this theme because when we think about what it means to make a recommender system fair, this is a very, very broad space. It's not just one problem. It's a broad family of problems. And there are some points on this space that are studied, and there are many points that are not well studied, and there are probably points that we don't even know exist yet. And so what I want to do with this talk basically is point you to the monsters. So my goal today is to give you a picture of the overall map of what some of the different problems that we can look at in recommendation fairness are. I want to position the objectives that EvalRS selected, particularly around fairness, in that map. And then discuss some, hopefully give you some ideas. So discuss some other work that's been done and at some additional or adjacent points in the map. And really my high level goal is to prompt further discussion both at the workshop and when you go home about how to go exploring some of these areas and problem spaces in fair recommendation that are not well understood yet. And also in thinking about next iterations of RecList and of the EvalRS kinds of challenges, what kinds of tweaks might one want to consider for the metrics? What kinds of new metrics might you want to consider putting into the such a challenge? So I hope you come away from this talk with many more questions and underspecified ideas than answers. If I've done that and you go do some interesting work in a problem that hasn't been studied yet, I will feel like I have done my job today. So, but going from medieval to give a little bit of context in how I think about these problems, that's going to motivate how I think about presenting them and how I think about finding them. As we travel from medieval Scandinavia to the present, let's take a really brief stop in Victorian England. So Elizabeth Gaskell wrote the novel North and South about a young woman from agrarian southern England who moves with her family to an industrialized northern city and is thrown into a conflict between the textile mill owners and the workers, because the big industry of this town was textiles. And so it raises and engages with, in the way that the good socially conscious Victorian novels do, a lot of questions about this new technological age of the industrial age. Who benefits from it? Who benefits from the increased production capacity, the industrialization, the ability to build factories? Who is a cog in the machine? Who has actual meaningful power to affect change in this world? And these themes then are also considered in the context of the information age by Ursula Franklin in her book and lecture series, The Real World of Technology. And in this book, or in these lectures, which the book is based on, she argues that it's best to understand technology not as a set of artifacts that we built, but as a process. And she argues specifically a process for organizing labor. And this process has impacts. And we need to ask many questions about it, such as who benefits, who pays, who controls, and who is being controlled by the technologies that are being developed and are being deployed in our local communities and online. And another vital one is who decides how it is built and what is built. Are communities involved in these decisions? Are people most at risk of getting the short end of the stick involved in these decisions, or have an opportunity for meaningful input into these decisions? And so this has influenced a lot of how I think about this material in terms of trying to make recommender systems and information retrieval systems fair, because we're building these systems, but who do they benefit? I believe they can provide a wide range of benefits to a wide range of people and have profoundly pro-social effects, but the question arises, do they? And how do we ensure that that is the family of effects that they have? So as a little bit of a warm-up example, I want to think about, I have here an example of some recommended job listings. If I just went into the LinkedIn and hit the job listing area, these are recommendations that it gave me. And the question that we often have historically asked in recommender evaluation is, are these good recommendations, useful to me? Do they match my skills and interests? We measure this by clicks or by whether I apply to the job. We might look at some things like, say, the diversity of the recommendations, particularly as it pertains to, but that's going to be super dependent on my particular needs. If I'm looking for a new job in my city, I might not want geographic diversity. If I'm looking to move and don't have preferences, I might. But then the point of the workshop is to move beyond one or maybe two ideas of what it means for the recommendation list to be good, and then to ask a variety of questions, including several questions around whether the list of jobs is fair. But this is a really hard question. The first thing we have to answer is, who are we talking about fairness to? Are we talking about fairness to me? Are we talking about fairness to hiring organizations? It's a really, really complicated question. And then, like, even if we say, okay, we want it to be fair to job applicants, what does that mean? They get comparably relevant jobs, they get jobs with comparable pay scales. It's a big, big, big open and complex problem. And this gets to one of the big challenges of working in fairness, is that there is no final answer. We can't write down, this is what it means for the system to be fair, and then go evaluate that or optimize that. Andrew Selbst and collaborators, in their excellent paper at FACT 2019, talk about various traps that we can fall into. And one of those traps is what's called the formalism trap, the idea that the mathematical formula that we come down to in the metric can fully capture everything that's going on. And fairness is what's called an essentially contested concept, which roughly means that as a society, we never stop arguing about it. And so it's contested, it's procedural and contextual. What it means to be fair is very bound up in the specifics of the problem and the application. And then there's also some challenges around, there's many assumptions. You have to set your fairness goal, you have to make a lot of assumptions. Not all reasonable goals are mutually compatible. And so we can't sit down and, okay, here's fairness, here's what we're going to do. What we can do, though, if we can't define fairness as a universal objective, what we can do is identify, measure, and mitigate specific fairness-related harms. And we can study how those harms relate to each other. And then from those, we can work to build bottom-up general strategies and principles that may apply across a range of harms, but do need to be revalidated as you go in, as you're looking at any particular harm that you want to try to do or try to address. And can target specific kinds of unfairness. So that basically we've got this really, really broad map. And what we can do is what EvalRS organizers did in putting it together. We can pick some specific points on that map and work on them. And if we work on more and more points, hopefully we make the system better. But universality is elusive, and many, including myself, would argue impossible. So with that, the paper that's kind of the backbone for what I'm talking about today is our monograph in Foundations and Trends in Information Retrieval on mapping harms, so identifying the dimensions for locating fairness-related information access harms, and then providing guidance for positioning, and then we also survey a lot of research in there. And this was joint work with Ana Das, Fernando Diaz, and Robin Burke. So the first question is thinking about who we're trying to be fair to. Do we want to be fair to the consumers of the users of the system? Two of the EvalRS fairness objectives tie to users. Do we want to be fair to the providers of the content, of the music recommendation context, the artists? It would be authors and book recommendation or news recommendation, etc. There's a whole bunch of other stakeholders. There's vendors. There are many, many vendors, record stores, etc. Online. And if you've got particularly, say, a marketplace kind of thing like Amazon Marketplace or eBay, you might try to be fair not only with regards to the individual products, but also be fair to the different vendors that are selling in your marketplace. Or if you're running, say, a global search engine, you might want to be fair to the different vendors you're routing people to. The subjects of the information, like who, this isn't as important for music, but it really starts to come up, say, in news. Who is the article about? And are different subjects fairly represented, or does what you see in your news recommendations skew you towards the concerns of one or another group, independent of who wrote the articles? Society has a number of concerns. There's shareholders, there's publishers or record labels in the music context. You might say want to be fair to indie labels, regardless of which of their artists recorded the particular song. So you've got this, which set of stakeholders for a particular fairness harm, which set of stakeholders are you concerned about right now? I'll also note that it's possible to have cross-group harms. So something that looks like a provider unfairness problem, for example, may also have consumer harms, because, say, if your list of if the authors who appear in your book recommendations on a particular topic is unfair, then it can give consumers an inaccurate picture of the space of who is writing about this problem. So then we have the question of that's been studied in a lot of fairness literature. Are we trying to be fair on an individual level or a group level? And the individual level of fairness is basically, the idea is to give each individual what they in some sense deserve, or to treat similar individuals similarly. The really, really easy way to do this on a consumer side in recommender systems is to average your metrics on a per user basis. So if you've got metrics to make sure like you compute a metric for each user and then average over the users, and that way each user counts just as much, and your the more active users don't dominate your metrics if you've got a metric that operates on a per interaction basis. Then there's group fairness, which gets a lot of attention, and it's what the fairness metrics in this workshop are focused on, which is looking to avoid systemic disparities between different groups. They can be groups of consumers, groups of providers, but the idea here is we want to avoid these systematic, and particularly depending on the precise formulation, systematic unjustified disparities. We can target explicit treatment, outcomes, errors, many different things. Common groups include gender, race, religion, age, country. Popularity is one that can be relevant. You might also want to look at, say, genre fairness. Do users who prefer particular genres get worse recommendations? Do artists performing in particular genres get less exposure? You might want to look at rookie versus established. So you might want to make sure that your system is providing fair opportunity for consumers to find a new artist's first single as opposed to the 20th single released by a well-established artist. So there's a whole bunch of different dimensions that you can think about. So in the EvalRS metrics, they were focused, all of them were focused on various concepts of fair utility. And so the key utility metric was this miss rate. And then you compute it by, it's disaggregated by consumer, producer, or item groups. And then it's computed as the mean of the difference between the group metric, the group average metric, and the absolute difference between the group average metric and the overall average metric. So if you've got, like, if everything's equal, then the groups are each going to have the same mean as the overall, and so this is 0. But if you've got more utility for one group and less than another, then those absolute differences are going to go up, and so this mean is going to go up. And script G here is just our set of groups, and a lowercase g is a group. So the group equity of utility on the consumer side, what this is trying to do is, so the goal of these metrics, say when we break down the miss rate by the user's gender, is to ensure that each consumer group should have comparable utility. And in my recent paper with Soleil Pera at the FactRec workshop last month, we called this family of objectives equity of utility. The goal is that each group has utility is equitably experienced by the different groups. And so you all did it with user gender, user country, and then user activity level, which in some ways at the extreme end, like the 0 activity user, becomes a way of framing user cold start as a fairness problem, which I totally am fine with and appreciate and do that sometimes. But so that's what the metrics you've been working with do. So in the context of figuring out a consumer fairness goal, there are a number of things that you have to identify. So this is a consumer fairness problem. We want to treat our different groups of users fine. We call it consumers rather than users because there are many people who use a system in the human-computer interaction sense. Like if you've got a streaming platform, the users, like the users who listen to music are the ones we think about first. But content like artists who directly are uploading their stuff, or the people at the labels who are managing artists' uploads, they're using the system. And so consumers, we're using that to be specific about, these are the users who are consuming the recommended items as opposed to other users. Or say if you've got a two-sided marketplace like eBay, sellers are selling and they're using the system. And so we just want to be clear about which set of users we're actually talking about. Lex Beatty and colleagues in their Rexus 2022 presentation called this process scoping, where you go from your goal and you identify precisely how you're going to consider it, how you're going to treat it, how you're going to operationalize it. And there are a few pieces that we have to think about here when we're looking at any of these consumer fairness problems. What is your goal? We just said the goal for the EvalRS ones is comparable utility across different consumer groups. What is your unit of analysis? Is it individual or is it group? If it's group, what groups? Gender, country, activity level. What is your metric? Miss rate. And then what is your aggregation? This mean absolute deviation. And these are in some sense pluggable. We can identify many different goals, units of analyses, metrics, and aggregations. And thinking about different combinations here become a really, really fruitful way to think about expanding, the space of what we're researching. So there's many goals possible. A few of them include, so equity of utility. We can also think about equity of usability in terms of, are different people able to actually use the system to get recommendations, or is it, say, inaccessible to some of our users? Is the system representing the users in some way that is fair? Is it perpetuating stereotypes about them? There are many different strategies that can pursue them. One thing I want to encourage you to ponder is, what if the goal is not for individual systems to be fair, but for the ecosystem of recommendation? Everybody can get fair access to recommendations, but they might not all be able to get it from the fair system or from the same system. That's something to think about. So I want to talk a little bit about this aggregate challenge. So the aggregate used this time was this mean absolute deviation. And so I'm gonna point out, so there's a challenge here though, and I hope this doesn't come across as too critical. I really, really love what you all have been doing, but I want to, part of my purpose here is to push to what can be improved for the next iteration. So how you minimize this is you give all groups the same metric. The challenge here is that it's effectively zero sum, because if you give one group utility, even if you don't hurt any other group's utility, the metric gets worse. But consumer utility, so economists have this sense of what's called a rivalrous good, where one person taking advantage of it means another person can't. But consumer utility isn't rivalrous. Like, one group getting good recommendations is not the reason the other group is getting bad recommendations. As one point, like if you're looking at utility, overall utility, like you want to increase the overall utility and you want to minimize the deviation, this does work pretty well. Like it works relatively well. You do have this challenge though, if you can do just a little bit better, if you say you can do better on this metric by decreasing utility for the well-served group. An alternative that was proposed at ICTIR last year, and I just learned about recently, is to look at positive sum aggregate metrics across your groups. And so what they did was they took the total group utility or the mean group utility, and they just summed the logs. And so the log has the effect of, once you have a bunch of utility, getting a little bit more is not worth as much in the overall metric. And so if I have one unit of utility I can add to some group, I do the best improving this metric by adding it to the least well-served group. I have not seen these metrics used very widely yet, but I think they're a really, really promising direction for thinking about how to get out of the zero-sum trap in thinking about consumer utility fairness. So we can also then think about provider equity. So so the way this was framed for this workshop is looking at being equally accurate to retrieving items from each provider group. We want the miss rate to be the same across provider groups. And then the item equity goal works the same way for song popularity instead of artist popularity. What this is trying, basically, if we turn this into a goal in terms of the user or the provider experience, what we're turning it into is, if the user wants a less popular artist, then the system should provide it just as well as they do if the user wants the more popular artist. This is a consumer-focused view of provider equity. As I said before, though, we can have cross-group harms. I like this consumer-focused view of provider equity. We want to make sure that we're providing the needs across a range of popular and niche interests. Another way that we can think about provider equity is through what's called exposure. And the idea here is you have a rank, say, particularly in the ranked list setting, the ranked list of items, they have some relevances, but the exposure decreases as you go through the list. So we assign how much exposure each position on the list is worth, and then we look at, do different providers or different provider groups or different items have comparable exposure? And so with that, there's one of the problems here is that comparably relevant items can get different exposure. We can see this, the first two rabbits have equal relevance, but very different exposures. If this is systemic by group, like one group is always 1 and the other one's just as relevant, but it's always 2, this pretty quickly violates group fairness. You also have the problem that only one item gets first position in any one ranking. And so you can't like make one ranking fair, but what you can look at doing is making a set of rankings fair, like you did for this workshop. You were looking at with aggregating it, you weren't concerned about making, the metric is not concerned about making, or the provider aggregated miss rate metric is not concerned about making every individual list fair. It's concerned about being fair across the set of lists that you want to do. So one of the metrics, though, that we use to explicitly frame this in terms of exposure is the construct of expected exposure. So we measure the exposure that items get across a set of rankings. And in the original paper, this was in the search setting, and it was a set of rankings that's in response to a single query. So you have a bunch of users coming in with the query in the course of a day or a week, and we want to see how the exposure is distributed in the responses to that query. And the principle of equal expected exposure is that given a fixed information need, so what the user's looking for when they type their query, or in a recommendation context, what they're interested in, no item should receive more or less expected exposure than any other item of the same relevance grade. So we're taking the expectation over stochastic rankings or over repeated visits to the site that get different results because we've got a stochastic ranker. And this operationalizes a goal of equality of opportunity, where equally relevant documents should have or items in the case of recommendation should have equal opportunity for good ranking. This is very similar, like in some ways it's almost more of a difference of perspective in how we frame the problem than a difference in actual outworking of the measurement from the provider aggregated miss rate. Because both effectively are conditioned on the user wanting the item, which is what we mean in a recommendation context by relevance in the expected exposure framework. We can extend it to group fairness by aggregating expected exposure over groups instead of just over individual items. There's a whole bunch of open questions on this thing. So there's a variety of goals. So as I said, we can look at provider disaggregated utility or accuracy or utility. We can look at exposure that's very explicitly provider side. Like I said, the difference in these seems to mostly be in the perspective that we take when interpreting them and thinking about them. Both are good ways of approaching the problem. A CIKM 2022 paper, and there's a few other surveys as well, take a look at a variety of metrics and provide comparisons of them. I refer you to that for future reading. There's a web page that goes with this talk that has my citation. The QR code for that's going to be on my concluding slide. There's a whole bunch of ways, though, that we can think about measuring fairness to providers. We can look at recommendation accuracy, as you're doing here. We can look at allocation of exposure, the expected exposure, Biega's equity of attention construct. We can look at equalized pairwise odds, as in Alex Buttel's paper in KDD 19, where the goal there is to make sure that a minority group item is a relevant minority group item is appropriately and accurately ranked above an irrelevant majority group item, and that it breaks down your pairwise loss by individual groups to make sure that you don't have accuracy disparities in terms of modeling. Is the minority group item more relevant than the dominant group item? So We can also look at the composition of the lists, like just the proportion of items in a list that are by a particular provider group. And there's many, many more ways that we can think about measuring fairness to providers in ways that address provider side harms, that address consumer side harms. Measuring items and subjects works a lot like measuring providers, but mathematically it's basically the same because they're all item attributes. Like the item attributed the item directly, the item has a subject and that has an attribute, the item has a provider and that has an attribute. So the math is the same, but the goal is different. They also need different data. An item, this is often easier because a lot of times our items come with metadata. And we can compute metadata from the other data that we have for our items. We've got latent feature spaces, like looking at the latent feature space diversity metric that you used this year. You can compute latent feature spaces, get features of items. Subject is often harder because while items often come with provider information, a song comes with its artist, providers don't necessarily declare, or items don't necessarily declare what or who they are about in a machine readable way. There's a whole lot we can get from Wikipedia and particularly Wikidata, but if you have a news article, how do you detect whether it's about urban, suburban, or rural? Or how do you detect the neighborhoods that are being reported on? If you have a research paper, like if you've got a medical research paper, do they declare in a machine readable fashion the racial demographics represented in the sub participants in the trial? Because if you're looking at looking at health issues that do have various social correlates or disproportionately affect particular groups, is your patient represented in the studies that you're looking at? You could look at fairness from that perspective, but the data is on who those subjects are not necessarily machine readable for and ready for us to use. So we've got a bunch of fairness concerns here. I've talked about a number of them, and they relate then to a variety of other concerns as well. So fairness and utility, sometimes they trade off, not necessarily. I find I'm skeptical of a lot of trade-offs because I think sometimes what we're trading off isn't, like, we might have a trade-off in the metric, but what we don't know when we see that trade-off is, are we actually trading off the underlying construct that the metric is measuring, or are we trading off bias or noise between the underlying construct and the metric? So we might be trading off the metric's error, not the metric's actual measurement. Diversity is very related to subject and provider fairness, and diversity enhancing recommendation techniques can be very useful for providing provider and subject fairness. The concerns often stem from different normative goals. Diversity is often related to being able to meet a diverse set of user information needs, or about providing a good representation of the space, which gets closer to a fairness goal. But say a pure subject fairness goal is looking, say, at the benefit that accrues to the subject or the provider. Novelty can sometimes be a fairness problem, but is our system unfair to new content or new providers, as you were looking at? So you were not looking at, say, rookie, but you were looking at less popular. So is it being fair to less popular? But you can also look at, like, is this track off the first album by an artist? That would be a fascinating goal to include. And then there are competing fairness concerns, as we've said. So the conclusion of all of that is that fairness is one part of a multifaceted analysis of the system. There's also some cases in which we might need to ask, is a particular kind of fairness actually harmful? Say, being fair to abject misinformation that is causing harm in society. So that's a quick tour of a number of the particular fairness concerns that particularly focus on allocations. We focused so far on what Crawford called distributive or allocative harms. How are the results of the output distributed? Well, when we're talking about the composition of the result list and whether the set of authors represented provides an accurate picture of the space, that's not quite an allocation harm, but we focus mostly on these allocative harms. But those concerns start to get closer to what Crawford called representative harms, which is where you're a unfair representative fairness harm is when you are unfairly misrepresented, particularly in the system, maybe misgendered, or maybe represented in a way that ties stereotypes to you. So another paper that I don't have the citation for in here, I'll add it to the web page when I'm done talking, looked at, it used adversarial learning to try to put in a discriminator that tried to predict a user protected attribute from their user embedding. And so you include that as an adversarial learning component to learning a recommendation model, and it tries to create these user embeddings where you can't predict the user's, say, gender. And if you've got an embedding that you can't predict gender from, then it's less likely that the resulting recommendations are going to be tied to gender stereotypes. So if we're going to go hunting, where are the monsters to go hunt? There is a lot of work of distribution of utility and value. Provider exposure, customer utility. Often it works in one group at a time. You saw a few different groups here. Also, the last couple runs of the track fair ranking track have multiple groups. There's less work on harms of representation, multiple groups. Dealing with the details of multiple users coming to the system coming to the users multiple times. There's not a lot of great framework yet for how to robustly deal with the incoming requests. Statistical analysis of the fairness results. What are the appropriate statistical tests, et cetera, for them? How do we appropriately collect and share the data? This is just a small example list. Many, many, many important problems to go hunting on. To give you a flavor of how we can go hunting for some of these problems, I want to talk very, very briefly here, and I'm watching my time, on some recent work on looking at the ability for the system to reproduce gender stereotypes. And this was not done in a recommendation setting, but in an e-commerce search setting, published at CIKM this year. And so the key problem is that society has these gender stereotypes. And when children are exposed to these, especially when they're young, this can have significant effect on how they see themselves and how they relate to the world. So we wanted to look at, do search engines reproduce these stereotypes? So we looked at a number of previous research papers on stereotypes in children and their play, also some advocacy. There are various campaigns that are advocating for stereotype-free childhood. Between these, we find a number of toys that they'd considered to have gender stereotypes in society. We used them as queries to the e-commerce system and then observed the system's responses. So we first looked at query suggestions. So we put into the query box toy for, and then we looked at the query suggestions and we counted the suggestions with gendered terms to see if it was more likely to suggest boys, more likely to suggest girls. If it didn't suggest genders, we see superhero toys here suggests boys a lot. And then we found a couple of things. One, e-commerce query suggestions did have gender alignment for toys. A lot of toys, like, they would be mostly boys, mostly girls. Alignment, and these alignments correlated more or less with previously documented stereotypes. So the previous research had identified this as a stereotype, toy stereotypes towards girls, and that was reflected in the query suggestions in the e-commerce platform. We also then looked at generic search results. So if we just stick in a query that's not specific to any particular toy family, like toys for kids, and we look at toys for boys and toys for girls, look at the words that show up in the gendered SERP, but not in the neutral SERP. And we found that words aligned with common gender stereotypes surfaced. We also then looked at the results themselves, and I'm running to the end of time here. So I'm gonna finish up relatively quickly. I'm almost done. So we look at so we take a toy and we issue it for kids, for boys, for girls, and then we look at the Jacquard similarity between boys and kids, girls and kids, to see which one it's more closely aligned with, and again found propagation of gender stereotypes. So I don't have time today to talk about the differences between classical fairness and Rexis. That's something you can find in our paper. What I do want to leave you with are a couple of thoughts on problem definition. So be very clear about when we're setting up a fairness problem, we need to be very clear about the goal. Fair treatment, are we defining fair as equality? Are we defining fair as in a context of justice or in a way that's specifically providing to provide reparations or reverse a past oppression? Are we developing in the context of a particular social welfare function? One of the things I find very useful is to separate my normative claims about what I think the system should do from my descriptive claims about what I think the system does. So even if someone has a different normative goal, they might still find my description useful. And then we need to clearly identify the stakeholders, the type and nature of the specific harm we're trying to address, the normative principles that drive why we care about this harm and why we're framing it the way we are, and then be very clear on the limitations of what we're doing. I also do this in the context of algorithmic realism, which was discussed in a FACTS 2020 paper by Green and Villewan, that focuses on what the algorithms actually do. Throw them at real data, use them with real users. What do they do? Not what do we think they should do from their mathematical definitions. So with all of that, there are many stakeholders, types of harm, timescales, groups and aggregates, and a lot of open questions and practical details. There is so much left to explore in this space of fair recommendation. Good hunting, and thank you. Happy to take questions.
So fantastic talk. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for engaging. So a few things. Thanks so much for engaging so much with our challenge. Really appreciate it. Second, I think it's telling that everybody that gave a talk today, both the participants and the keynote speakers, pointed out to mistakes that we made. This is fantastic. This is a feature. This is not a bug. This is the reason why we organize this instead of just, posting stuff online, is to engage with the community and, know what we do wrong. I think a huge part of the role of academia in society, especially in XML, is kind of like keeping us in check in some sense, as you have more time and more freedom to think about this than we do. So thanks so much for engaging into that. Fantastic. And third, I was at CIKM as one of the organizer. So I'm familiar with the work. So thanks so much also for bringing that to attention. We have 2 organizers of CIKM here. Well, 1.5 for next year. So yeah, so for those of you who know, is a super cool venue for presenting work in e-commerce. So everybody here is encouraged like next year to do that. Now that I'm done with the marketing, I open the floor for questions. I know Federico has one, but everybody else, please ask away. Fede, you can start.
Yeah. Thanks so much for the talk. I think like super interesting, and like I really like the view on the actual like kind of fairness, bias, and stereotypes. I have a very general question that is, we know that like the data sets we have are samples that tend to show like stereotypical aspects of the world we work on. And we also know that like ML system tend to amplify those biases. So how easy it is, or like how well can fairness metrics be applied to evaluate a situation in which the data sets on which we evaluate is already like stereotypical? And I guess like this kind of can make like the difference in a lot of tasks, but also like it represents itself when we talk about the online and the offline evaluation of the model. So we might see like the better fairness in the offline settings because like we have a biased data set, but then online this doesn't work because the data set itself is biased and not realistic.
So that's a really, really good question, and it's really, really hard. Because, and even like when we're looking at, say, the utility metrics, if our like anything that uses utility or relevance, if our utility data is biased, then we're going to learn, oh, it's fair because its exposure is proportional to relevance, but we have a relevance disparity. And so what's happening is actually the fairness metric is justifying a disparity on the basis of the existing data. Really hard problem, for which I hope to have more answers in a year or 2 or 5. That'll be a long project. I will say, like, one of my PhD students is looking at one specific corner of that for a piece of her dissertation research, but it's a piece of it that hasn't been done yet. But I think there are a few things that we can do. One is if we have a model of the bias, we can try to correct for it. If we don't know the right model for the bias, but we have a few candidates, we can try them and do a sensitivity analysis to see like how does the result change depending on which bias correction we employ.
Okay.
We can also, in some cases, we can try to get more data, maybe a small set of data that's collected in a very deliberate way that avoids some of the biases that we're trying to correct for. And we can use that perhaps to develop or calibrate a model of the bias in the whole data set, or we can at least use it, okay, we can evaluate our system on this small corner. People have done this with collecting missing at random music data sets, like Pablo Castells and his students have done that for music, also the Yahoo R3 data set. That's looking at specifically at the missing at random effects, but we could look at similar data set construction mechanisms to try to very deliberately craft a probably small set of data that avoids some of those biases. Sometimes we're going to have to get really creative and then, but then try to assess how sensitive our findings are to the assumptions that we made in that creative process. There's also a space that I haven't. So there's the tricks that are done to deal with, to try to get unbiased feedback in the face of position bias for learning to rank stuff, where like you perturb positions 3 and 4, that kind of thing. I would love to see some work trying to look at, are there low stakes interventions that can be used to try to collect less biased data for fairness problems? I don't know what that would look like, but that's a direction we can look at going.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yubin, CIKM Commerce organizer.
All right. Thanks for the talk, Michael. Really interesting. I have a pretty broad question / comment for you. I would love your thoughts. So one of the big challenges that I see in a lot of fairness research is that in the end, like, it's going to make an impact if it finds its way into a production system that, you know, a lot of people use, right? So the Amazons, the Googles, the Spotifys of the world, right? Etsy too. But we unfortunately live in a capitalistic society, and the motivation, the incentive structures of these companies demand that, you know, it's tied to some financial value. So I'm thinking about how we can draw connections between, because I strongly believe that fairness is better for, like, commercially, like financially better for the companies that are implementing it too. But I would love your thoughts on how we as a community can draw some of those lines, connect those connecting lines, and maybe help market fairness research a little bit better for industry. Because like one of the big failure modes that I see for fairness research in industry is that if the group is doing fairness and the company sees that as, like, you know, a gatekeeper, or, you know, a group that only like poo-poos, you know, revenue generating methods, then those groups tend to go away really quickly and they tend to fail really quickly.
So there are a few answers, and I'll give credit here for the good ideas to Fernando Diaz, because he contributed this piece of our tutorial a few years ago, and the errors and mistranslations are, of course, all mine. But there's a few different things that we can look at in terms of incentives, in terms of arguments. One is a financial and commercial incentive, and I think this is particularly clear for consumer fairness, but we can also see it on provider fairness. If you are systematically providing lower quality of service to a segment of the market, that is a market weakness. Someone else can compete on providing better service to this group that's not being well served by the existing players. And maybe they just have a nice business that's meeting their particular needs, or maybe that's a beachhead that they use to compete with the established business more broadly. And so that, particularly if I were in a commercial setting, that would probably often be the first argument I go for, is the places where we are not doing a good job of serving the users, of serving the sellers, of serving the providers of our content. They might want to leave. That's a market weakness. And if our competitors find it before we do, that can be exploited against our position in the market. There's also the New York Times effect kind of things of how do you want to learn about that you have a fairness problem first? Do you want to learn about it because your own researchers found it and surfaced it for mitigation? Or do you want to learn about it because someone else found it and it's on the front page of a national newspaper or a national tech magazine? And so being proactive to get ahead of the curve and avoid PR failures, I would put forward as another argument for a reason that we can do it. In some settings, there's regulatory and compliance things that you can point to. This isn't going to apply in all things, and it's all super fuzzy because we haven't actually litigated most of it. But say in job recommendation, I have heard LinkedIn talk in some of their talks about being concerned about this, of to what extent does anti-discrimination law for employment apply to LinkedIn's job opening recommendation thing? And if there's, say, gender discriminatory biases in which ads they show to, or which job listings they surface to which users, like they're operating in a regulated domain, also similarly housing. So sometimes there's a regulatory angle that can be pushed on. And sometimes, like if you can get the buy-in just from a do the right thing perspective, it's great. But if like those are the four that Fernando identified and put in our, we talked about a little bit in our tutorial, but those are the ones that I would often go for, is like, this is a like not serving, particularly systematically not providing good service to a segment of users is a market vulnerability. And if your competitors find it first, or you find it first, makes a difference in the marketplace. But I do also think on the research side that we need to think as academic researchers about how do we make our stuff accessible and useful. That's one of the reasons why a lot of my own work focuses a lot on methodology, is because, like, okay, I can go test a few systems, but I mean, I can test ALS on Movie Lens, but that doesn't mean that that's what IMDb is actually doing. But methodology, my goal is to provide methods that if you can get the buy-in through market reasons, PR reasons, sympathetic, appropriate manager reasons, then we can provide the tools that you can go use. Does that get to your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have one more question? Question for the audience? Question? You have a question? Sure, please. One more question, Michael.
Hi, I'm Will, and nice to meet you again. And thanks for your presentation. I have a question. This question is actually motivated by one of the settings in this EvalRS challenge, which requires us to have a minimum hit rate score, or we don't actually have the final score. So my question is, if we can only select one dimension as the major metric, and then we can move on to evaluate on the other metric. So do you think recommending item precisely is more important for recommending fairly, or let's say recommending items precisely on top of the fairness, or fairness on top of recommending precisely? Thank you.
So that's a good question. And generally, if they're separate metrics, I would go for fair, or excuse me, not for fair, for accurate first, because if you provide fair recommendations, but they're all irrelevant, then you're not helping the user. You're not helping the provider, because you're not actually matching, like, oh, so we recommended you a diverse set of musical artists, but you don't actually want to listen to any of their music because you're not into whatever it is that they're recording. And so, like, the system needs to do its job. And so having that gate on effectiveness, I think, is useful, so that we make sure that's actually doing a good job. And then also, a lot of fairness techniques are implemented, say, as re-rankers or as tweaks on a model that's already optimizing for accuracy. And so I think that is that's a decent approach. We can also look at metrics that integrate them, like expected exposure integrates fairness and relevance. But I think, yeah, first, like, if the system's not useful, it's not helping anybody, even if it's producing a bunch of fair but irrelevant results. And so, yeah, we need it to be useful. I would say that we need a sufficient, having a gate rather than an optimum on the usefulness is probably good, because if it's just, oh, we're only going to take the systems with the highest accuracy on our metric, then we're optimizing not only for the highest accuracy in terms of actual utility, but also in terms of how that metric operationalizes it. But the metric might have error and noise. And so if we think about it better, like let's take a set of systems that are good enough. Maybe they beat our current system or they beat some threshold. And then among the systems that are good enough, then we start working on fairness. I think that can be a really productive way to go.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Michael, thanks again for being with us, notwithstanding, the challenges of this week. We enjoyed the presentation. I will actually be in touch for sure to continue working together. I think there's a lot of overlapping teams here, but thanks again for being with us.
Thank you for having me.